The morning sun peeked through the blinds of Clint Eastwood's ranch-style home in Carmel-by-the-Sea, California. The legendary actor and director sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee while reading through the pile of scripts that seemed to grow taller with each passing week. At 94 years old, most men would have long since retired to a life of leisure, but Eastwood had always been cut from a different cloth. His weathered hands moved methodically through the pages, occasionally making notes in the margins. His focus was interrupted by the gentle ringing of his phone. His assistant Tom had been with him for over 15 years now, and knew better than to disturb him during his morning routine unless it was important. "Morning, Tom," Eastwood answered, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had become his trademark over the decades. "Morning, boss. Sorry to bother you, but I've got Rachel Wilson from American Tonight on the other line. She's pretty insistent about speaking with you directly." Eastwood sighed. American Tonight was one of the highest-rated talk shows in the country, known for its thoughtful interviews with public figures. Still, he'd been declining most television appearances lately, preferring to let his work speak for itself. "What does she want?" he asked, looking out at the cypress trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. "She wants you to come on the show next month to talk about Shadows of Redemption," Tom replied, referring to Eastwood's latest directorial project, a deeply personal film about an aging veteran seeking reconciliation with his estranged family. Something in Eastwood's gut told him this wasn't just another promotional opportunity. Rachel Wilson had a reputation for creating meaningful television moments, not just chasing ratings. Put her through, he decided. The conversation with Rachel lasted nearly 30 minutes, much longer than Eastwood typically spent on phone calls these days. There was something in her approach, a genuine appreciation for his body of work and a desire to create something meaningful for viewers that resonated with him. "Mr. Eastwood, this isn't just about promoting your new film," Rachel had explained. "Your career spans 7 decades. You've shaped American cinema in ways few others have. We want to honor that legacy." She was deliberately vague about certain details of the segment, mentioning only that they had something special planned. Ordinarily, this would have been enough for Eastwood to decline politely. He'd never been one for surprises, especially on live television. But as he listened to Rachel outline her vision, he found himself intrigued by the possibility of sharing something more meaningful with audiences than the usual promotional chatter. After hanging up, Eastwood walked onto his porch, coffee in hand, and looked out at the Pacific Ocean in the distance. The film he'd just completed was perhaps his most personal yet, a meditation on aging, regret, and the possibility of redemption even in life's final chapter. Maybe this was an opportunity to contextualize that work within the broader arc of his career. "Tom," he called, having made his decision, "tell Rachel I'll do it." The next few weeks passed quickly as Eastwood wrapped up post-production on his film. The interview wasn't at the forefront of his mind until Tom dropped by his editing suite with a folder of preparation materials sent over by the American Tonight team. "They're pretty thorough," Tom commented as Eastwood flipped through the pages containing potential talking points, background on the host, and logistical details for the appearance. What caught Eastwood's attention, however, was a handwritten note from Rachel. "Mr. Eastwood, thank you for trusting us with this conversation. No ambushes, no gotcha moments, just an honest discussion about your remarkable journey and the stories you've chosen to tell. Looking forward to creating something special together. Rachel." The note struck a chord with Eastwood. Throughout his career, he'd valued authenticity above all else, both in his work and in his personal interactions. He appreciated Rachel's straightforward approach. As the day of the interview approached, Eastwood found himself unusually reflective. In his home office, surrounded by awards he rarely displayed publicly, and photographs spanning decades in the industry, he spent an evening looking through old albums and mementos from his career. There was a faded photograph from his days on Rawhide, standing alongside Eric Fleming with a lasso over his shoulder, his face young and unlined. Next to it, a candid shot from the set of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, with Sergio Leone gesturing animatedly in the background. Flipping through the pages, He paused at images from the Dirty Harry era, when he'd become an international icon. But it was the more recent photographs that gave him the deepest sense of satisfaction. Behind the camera as a director, working with actors he respected, telling stories that mattered to him. His evolution from actor to filmmaker had been the most fulfilling journey of his professional life. The night before the interview, Eastwood's daughter Kate called to wish him luck. "Dad, are you nervous about tomorrow?" she asked, knowing her father's typical aversion to public sentimentality. "Not nervous," he replied after a moment's consideration. "Just hoping I can say something worthwhile." "Just be yourself," she advised. "That's always been more than enough." The morning of the interview, Eastwood arrived at the studio 2 hours early, as was his habit on film sets. He preferred having time to get the lay of the land, to understand the space he'd be working in. A young production assistant nearly dropped her clipboard when she rounded a corner and found him wandering the hallway, examining the photographs of past guests that lined the walls. "Mr. Eastwood, you're early," she stammered, clearly flustered by the unexpected encounter with the Hollywood legend. "Always am," he replied with a slight smile that instantly put her at ease. "Mind showing me around?" The tour ended at his dressing room, where Rachel was waiting to greet him personally. In her mid-50s, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned her position through hard work and integrity. "Mr. Eastwood, thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand. "It's truly an honor. Call me Clint," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. "And the honor's mine. You've built quite a show here." They spent the next hour talking through the flow of the interview, how they'd start with discussion of his new film, before broadening to reflect on his career. Rachel was transparent about most aspects of the conversation, but remained purposely vague about what she called a special segment in the latter half of the show. "I promise it's nothing that will make you uncomfortable," she assured him. "But I do think it might surprise you." Eastwood studied her face for a moment before nodding. "I'm trusting you on that." As the makeup artist made final touches, Eastwood had always insisted on minimal makeup, just enough for the cameras. He could hear the audience filing into the studio, their excited chatter creating a low hum beyond the dressing room walls. Tom knocked on the door. "5 minutes, boss." Alone for a moment, Eastwood straightened his navy blue jacket and took a deep breath. Despite his decades of experience, he still felt that familiar tightening in his chest before any public appearance. It wasn't exactly nervousness, more like a heightened awareness that what he said and did in the next hour would become part of the public record, another piece of the legacy he'd spent 7 decades building. A stagehand appeared at the door. "We're ready for you, Mr. Eastwood." As he walked through the winding corridor toward the stage, Eastwood thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the young actor who'd struggled through bit parts to the filmmaker who now had the freedom to tell exactly the stories he wanted to tell. He'd never been one for public displays of emotion or lengthy reflections on his own career. He preferred looking forward to the next project rather than dwelling on past achievements. But today felt different somehow. There was a sense that this appearance might offer an opportunity to share something meaningful with the audiences who had followed his work for generations. Not just about his films, but about the philosophy that had guided his life and career. When he heard the host's voice announce his name and the surge of applause that followed, Eastwood squared his shoulders and stepped into the bright lights of the studio, ready to begin an interview that would prove far more memorable than anyone, especially Eastwood himself, could have anticipated. As Clint Eastwood settled into the guest chair under the bright studio lights, Rachel Wilson's production team was busy in a separate room, putting the finishing touches on what they hoped would be one of the most memorable segments in the show's history. "How's the audio on those old clips?" asked Dave, the show's executive producer, leaning over the shoulder of Liz, their senior editor who had spent the last 3 weeks assembling the special montage. "We've cleaned up everything we could," Liz replied, clicking through the timeline on her editing software. "Some of that footage from the 50s was pretty rough, but you can hear him clearly now." The monitor displayed a young Eastwood on the set of Rawhide, his face unlined, eyes squinting against the California sun, as he delivered his lines with a rawness that hinted at the star he would become. "And you're sure he doesn't know about any of this?" Dave asked, nervousness evident in his voice. Surprising a Hollywood legend on live television was either going to be brilliant or a disaster. "Rachel's been careful," Liz assured him. "He knows we're doing something special, but not what. The testimonials have been our best-kept secret." In another corner of the production room, Penny, the segment producer, was on the phone, confirming last-minute details with the final participant in their surprise. "So you're absolutely certain you can be on standby for the live video call?" she asked, scribbling notes. "Mr. Eastwood will be completely surprised, so your reaction needs to be genuine too." Hanging up, she turned to Dave. "Now that's everyone confirmed. All the video testimonials are edited in, and we have 3 live video calls ready to patch in during the segment." Dave nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of anxiety and excitement that came with potentially groundbreaking television. "Let's hope the famously stoic Mr. Eastwood gives us something to work with." Meanwhile, in the green room, Tom scrolled through messages on his phone while keeping one eye on the monitor showing Eastwood's interview. The first segment was going exactly as expected. Professional, thoughtful, with Eastwood's characteristic economy of words as he discussed his latest film. A production assistant poked her head in. "How's he doing?" she asked, nodding toward the screen. "That's just Clint being Clint," Tom replied with a smile. "Giving just enough, keeping the rest close to the vest. Do you think he'll be okay with the surprise segment? He doesn't seem like someone who enjoys being caught off guard." Tom considered this. In 15 years working with Eastwood, he'd seen the director's infamous intensity up close, but he'd also witnessed moments of surprising warmth and humor that few outside his inner circle ever got to see. "He'll be fine," Tom decided, "as long as it's honest. That's the only thing that really matters to him." On set, Rachel was expertly guiding the conversation from Eastwood's new film to his broader body of work. "Your career has spanned from television, westerns to iconic film roles to award-winning direction," she noted. "Is there a common thread that connects your work across 7 decades?" Eastwood took a moment before answering, something he often did when considering a substantive question. "I think it's always been about telling stories that feel true," he said finally. "Not necessarily true in a factual sense, but emotionally authentic. Characters facing real choices with real consequences." Rachel nodded encouragingly. "You've played some of cinema's toughest characters. Yet as a director, you've shown remarkable sensitivity in films like $1 Million Baby and The Bridges of Madison County. Is that a conscious choice to show different sides of your artistic vision?" "I never really thought about it that way," Eastwood admitted. "I just respond to good stories. Sometimes those stories have more action, sometimes more emotion. But if they're honest about the human condition, that's what draws me in." As they continued talking, Dave's voice came through Rachel's earpiece. "We're ready for the special segment whenever you want to transition." Rachel waited for a natural pause in the conversation before leaning slightly forward in her chair. "Clint, we've been talking about your remarkable career, and I mentioned earlier that we had something special planned for today's show." Eastwood's eyebrow raised slightly, the only indication of his curiosity. "With your permission, I'd like to share something with you and our audience." He gave a small nod. "Go ahead." Rachel turned toward the main studio screen. "For the past month, we've been reaching out to people who've worked with you throughout your extraordinary career. People who know the real Clint Eastwood, not just the public persona. We asked them to share their thoughts about your impact, on cinema, but also on them personally." A flicker of surprise crossed Eastwood's face, quickly replaced by his usual composed expression. But those who knew him well might have noticed a slight tensing of his posture, a subtle sign that he was moving outside his comfort zone. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the screens came to life. In the control room, Liz gave a thumbs up to her assistant. "Roll the package." The montage began with black and white footage from Rawhide, Eastwood on horseback, young and impossibly handsome. The clip dissolved to behind-the-scenes footage from the Sergio Leone westerns that made him an international star. Eastwood standing in the Spanish desert, squinting against the harsh sun. As the visual timeline of his career progressed through Dirty Harry, Every Which Way But Loose, and into his directorial work, the voiceover began, not a narrator, but the actual voices of those who had worked with him over the decades. I was just a kid when I first worked with Clint, began the distinctive voice of an acclaimed actor who had appeared in 3 of Eastwood's films. Everyone told me he was a man of few words, that he could be intimidating. What I found instead was a director who trusted me completely, who gave me the space to find the character in my own way. The montage continued with another voice, this one belonging to a legendary actress who had won an Oscar for her role in one of his films. What makes Clint different is his quiet confidence. He never raises his voice, never needs to prove he's the smartest person in the room. But somehow, he pulls performances out of actors they didn't know they had in them. In the studio, Eastwood sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the screen. Rachel watched him carefully, ready to intervene if he seemed uncomfortable with the tribute. But while his expression remained composed, there was an intensity in his gaze that suggested he was genuinely moved by what he was seeing. The montage shifted to include testimony from crew members, cinematographers, script supervisors, production assistants, people whose names weren't known to the public but who had experienced Eastwood's leadership firsthand. In 50 years in this business, I've never worked with a director who treated every single person on set with the same respect, said an elderly man identified as a gaffer who had worked on 7 of Eastwood's films. Doesn't matter if you're bringing him coffee or you're the star of the picture. With Clint, everyone gets the same consideration. A younger woman, identified as a first-time script supervisor on one of his recent films, added, "He took a chance on me when no one else would. I was terrified my first day, and he just looked at me and said, 'You wouldn't be here if you couldn't do the job.' That simple vote of confidence changed everything for me." As the testimonials continued, interspersed with iconic moments from his films, the montage began to reveal a more complete picture of the man behind the legend. Not just his artistic achievements, but the human impact he'd had on those who worked with him. In the production room, Dave whispered to Liz, "Are we getting good shots of his reaction?" Liz nodded, pointing to a monitor showing a close-up of Eastwood. "Camera 2 has him perfectly. He's totally engaged." The final section of the montage shifted focus from industry professionals to everyday people whose lives had been touched by Eastwood's work. An elderly veteran described how Gran Torino had helped him process his own war experiences. A middle-aged woman explained how the bridges of Madison County had given her courage to pursue a long-deferred dream. As the last clip faded, the studio remained dimly lit for a moment before gradually brightening again. Rachel allowed a few seconds of silence, sensing that both Eastwood and the audience needed a moment to process what they'd just witnessed. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "I think what comes through in all those testimonials, Clint, is that beyond your remarkable artistic achievements, you've had a profound impact on people as individuals." Eastwood cleared his throat, clearly gathering his thoughts. For a man known for his composure, he seemed to be working harder than usual to maintain it. "That's very kind of them to say," he said finally, his voice slightly rougher than before. Rachel nodded, understanding that they were approaching emotional territory that Eastwood rarely entered in public. "We have a few more people who wanted to speak with you today, if that's all right. People who couldn't record their messages beforehand." Eastwood nodded and Rachel gestured toward the screen. "Let's bring them in." As the screen flickered to life once more, the control room prepared for the next phase of their carefully orchestrated tribute. Live conversations with 3 people whose connections to Eastwood spanned different eras of his remarkable career, each with a personal story that would test even further the legendary filmmaker's famous composure. The studio fell into a hushed silence as the screen flickered to life. Eastwood shifted slightly in his chair, his weathered hands resting on his knees. For a man who had spent decades in front of cameras, he suddenly looked almost vulnerable, in his stillness. The first face to appear on the screen belonged to an elderly man with sharp blue eyes and a worn cowboy hat. Gene Reynolds, now in his 90s, who had been a director on Rawhide when Eastwood was just starting out. "Well, hello there, Clint. the old man said, his voice wavering slightly with age but warm with affection. Been a long time since those early days, hasn't it? A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Eastwood's face, followed by a smile that reached his eyes. "Gene," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You're looking good," the old director chuckled. "I'm hanging in there. Not quite as spry as you, still making movies in your 90s. In the control room, Dave whispered to Liz, "This is gold. Look," at Eastwood's face. On screen, Gene continued, "You know, I've been wanting to tell you something for about 60 years now. Back in those days, nobody, and I mean nobody, thought you'd amount to much beyond rawhide. Too quiet, they said. Not enough flash." He paused, adjusting his hat. "I remember telling the producer, that young man watches everything, never misses a trick. He's learning this business from the ground up. And look what you did, Clint. You didn't just become a star. You reinvented what it means to be a filmmaker in Hollywood." In the studio, the audience sat transfixed, witnessing a conversation that spanned more than half a century of cinema history. "I learned a lot from you, Gene," Eastwood replied, his usual economy of words carrying genuine emotion. "You were one of the good ones." "Well, I appreciate that," Gene said, "but I'll tell you what I really called in to say. Back in '65, when you were heading off to Spain to make that Western with the Italian fellow, everyone thought you were crazy, throwing away your TV career on some foreign film nobody would see." Gene leaned closer to his camera. "I ran into your agent at the Brown Derby, and he was beside himself, but I told him, that boy knows exactly what he's doing. I've never been so right about anything in my life." A soft chuckle rippled through the studio audience. Eastwood shook his head, a half-smile playing at his lips as he remembered that pivotal moment in his career. "I didn't know that story," he said. "Well, now you do," Gene replied. "And I'll tell you something else. Watching you grow from that quiet young actor into one of the greatest directors American cinema has ever produced has been one of the great privileges of my life." For a moment, Eastwood seemed at a loss for words, a rare occurrence for the filmmaker known for his decisive nature. "Thank you, Gene," he said finally. "That means a lot, coming from you." As Gene's image faded from the screen, Rachel waited, a beat before speaking. "I believe we have another call coming in." The screen lit up again, this time showing a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense expression that softened as soon as she saw Eastwood. She had been his longtime production designer, working on his films for nearly 25 years. "Hello, boss," she said with a grin. "Linda." Eastwood nodded, clearly surprised, but pleased to see her. "How's retirement treating you?" "Better than it's treating you, apparently," she quipped. "Some of us actually know how to stop working." Their easy banter spoke of a long professional relationship built on mutual respect. In the audience, people smiled, getting a glimpse of how Eastwood interacted with his trusted collaborators. "You know, Clint," Linda continued, her tone growing more serious, "I worked with a lot of directors before you, and a few after. Never met anyone who ran a set like you do. Is that good or bad?" Eastwood asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "The best," she said without hesitation. "No yelling, no drama, just this quiet expectation that everyone would do their absolute best work, and somehow that was more motivating than any tantrum another director might throw." Linda leaned forward. "But what I really wanted to say was thank you. In 1998, when my husband got sick during pre-production on True Crime, you told me to go home and be with him. You said, 'The movie will wait, family won't.' You held that job for me for 3 months, Clint. Not many directors would have done that." In the control room, Liz nudged Dave. "Camera 3, she whispered. "Get that shot." Camera 3 had captured a close-up of Eastwood's face, the subtle tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible bob of his Adam's apple as he swallowed hard. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. "It was," Linda agreed. "And that's what makes you who you are. The films are magnificent, Clint, but it's the way you treat people that sets you apart. Always has been." As Linda's call ended, Rachel noticed Eastwood taking a sip of water, She gave him a moment before continuing. "We have one more call if you're okay to continue," she asked gently. Eastwood nodded, setting down his glass. "I'm fine." The third face to appear on screen belonged to a young man in his early 30s, the son of Eastwood's longtime stunt double who had passed away 5 years earlier. "Mr. Eastwood," the young man began, his resemblance to his father striking. "Bobby," Eastwood acknowledged, his voice warming with recognition. "You look more like your dad every time I see you." Bobby smiled at that. "I take that as the highest compliment." In the audience, people leaned forward, sensing they were about to witness something especially meaningful. "I know you and my dad. Worked together for what, almost 40 years? Bobby asked. 38? Eastwood corrected, the precision showing how much those years had mattered. "From High Plains Drifter right through to Gran Torino." Bobby nodded. "What people might not know is how you stood by him at the end. When he got sick and the medical bills started piling up, you didn't just help out. You made sure he got the best care possible. You visited him every week even when you were in the middle of editing a film." The young man paused, collecting himself. "But what I really wanted to thank you for was what you told me at his funeral. You pulled me aside and said, 'Your father never took the easy way out of anything. He lived with integrity. That's a legacy worth more than any amount of fame or money.'" Bobby's voice grew thick with emotion. "I've tried to live by those words, Mr. Eastwood, and I wanted you to know that my dad considered you not just his boss but his best friend." The camera caught Eastwood's reaction, a moment of raw emotion quickly brought under control, but not before everyone had seen it. His jaw clenched briefly, his eyes suspiciously bright under the studio lights. "Your father was one of the best men I ever knew," Eastwood said, his voice rougher than usual. "He made me look good on screen for nearly 4 decades, but more importantly, he showed me what it means to face life's challenges head-on. That's not something you forget." Bobby nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you for saying that," he managed finally. As the call ended, the studio remained completely silent. The audience, the crew, even Rachel, all seemed to understand. They were witnessing something rare and precious from a man famous for his emotional restraint. Rachel allowed the silence to linger for a respectful moment before speaking. "Clint, I want to thank you for allowing us to surprise you with these calls. I know you're someone who values privacy and doesn't particularly enjoy being the center of attention this way." Eastwood cleared his throat. "It was unexpected, but good to see those folks." "What strikes me," Rachel said gently, "is that when people talk about working with you, they don't just mention your films. They talk about who you are as a person, the humanity behind the legend." Eastwood looked momentarily uncomfortable with the praise, shifting slightly in his chair. "I've just tried to treat people the way I'd want to be treated," he said. "Nothing complicated about that. And yet it seems relatively rare in your industry," Rachel observed. "Maybe," Eastwood conceded. "But I've been fortunate to work with good people. Makes it easy to do the right thing." As the interview continued, viewers at home and in the studio audience were seeing a side of Clint Eastwood rarely glimpsed in public, the man behind the icon whose gruff exterior masked a deep well of loyalty, principle, and yes, emotion. In the production booth, Dave turned to Liz with a satisfied smile. "We're not even to the main surprise yet," he said quietly. Liz nodded, checking her watch. 4 minutes until we roll the final package. Think he's ready for it?" Dave watched Eastwood on the monitor, noting how the legendary director seemed more relaxed now, as if the unexpected reconnection with old friends had broken through some of his usual reserve. "I think so," he replied. "But whatever happens next, we've already got something special here." As Rachel prepared to transition to the final segment of the interview, she glanced at her notes. What was coming next had been months in the making, a tribute not just to Eastwood's career, but to the lasting impact of his storytelling on everyday people around the world, people whose lives had been changed in ways large and small by the films he had created over 7 remarkable decades in Hollywood. For a man who had always insisted he was just telling stories, the revelation of how deeply those stories had resonated was about to test even Clint Eastwood's legendary composure. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her expression warm but professional. Clint, throughout your career, you've told stories that have resonated with millions of people around the world. But I'm curious, do you ever think about the real-world impact your films have had on individual lives? Eastwood considered the question, taking his time as he often did before answering. I don't spend much time dwelling on it, he admitted. When you're making a film, you're focused on telling that story, as honestly as you can. What happens after it leaves your hands, how people receive it, what it means to them, that's largely out of your control. Rachel nodded. That's understandable. But what if I told you we've found some rather remarkable examples of how your work has affected ordinary people in extraordinary ways? Something in her tone caught Eastwood's attention. He raised an eyebrow, a gesture familiar to anyone who had watched his films over the decades. What do you mean? With your permission, we'd like to show you something we've been working on for the past several months, Rachel said. It's quite different from the industry tributes you've just seen. Eastwood gave a slight nod. Go ahead. Rachel turned toward the main studio screen once more. Over the past 6 months, we put out a call asking people to share stories about how your films affected their lives in meaningful ways. The response was overwhelming. We received thousands of submissions from around the world. What you're about to see is just a small selection of those stories. The studio lights dimmed again and the screen flickered to life. The image that appeared wasn't a film clip this time, but the face of an elderly man sitting in what looked like a modest living room. A caption identified him as Richard, 84, from Nebraska. I was a Vietnam vet with severe PTSD, the man began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. For 30 years after coming home, I couldn't talk about what happened over there, couldn't process it. My wife tried to get me to see counselors, but I always refused. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then in 2006, I watched Letters from Iwo Jima. Here was Clint Eastwood, this quintessential American tough guy, showing the humanity of Japanese soldiers, our former enemies. Somehow, seeing war from the other side broke something open in Richard's eyes grew misty. I went to therapy the following week, started talking for the first time. That film didn't just change my life, it might have saved it. My grandkids now have a grandfather who can be present with them instead of locked away in his own mind. As Richard's face faded from the screen, Eastwood remained still, his expression thoughtful. In the control room, Liz glanced at Dave. He's taking it in, she whispered. This is good. The next face on the screen belonged to a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. The caption read, Teresa, 56, from Arizona. I became a nurse because of $1 Million Baby, she began. I know that sounds strange since it's such a heartbreaking film, but the dignity and compassion shown to Maggie's character made me realize what I wanted to do with my life. She leaned closer to the camera. Mr. Eastwood, you directed that film with such honesty about suffering and difficult choices. It made me want to be present for people in their hardest moments, to offer them the same kind of unvarnished compassion your character showed. Teresa smiled. I've been a hospice nurse for 15 years now. Every day I try to give my patients what your film showed me, not false hope, but true dignity and presence in their final days. In the studio, a camera caught Eastwood swallowing hard, his jaw tightening momentarily. For a man who rarely showed emotion in public, these subtle signs spoke volumes. The montage continued with a young man in his 20s, speaking from what looked like a college dorm room. My dad and I never really got along, he explained, his words rushing out as if he'd been waiting a long time to say them. He was old school, tough, never talked about feelings, kind of like a character from one of your westerns, actually. The young man smiled ruefully. When I was 17, he suggested we watch Gran Torino together. It was the first time we'd done anything together in years. I think he saw himself in your character, the gruff exterior, the difficulty connecting with a younger generation. He paused, emotion flickering across his face. By the end of that film, my dad was crying. I'd never seen him cry before, ever. He turned to me and said, I don't want to end up alone like that guy. I want to know you. The young man shook his head in wonder. We started talking that night, really talking. and haven't stopped since. Your film gave my dad a way to see himself from the outside, to recognize what he might lose if he didn't change. You gave me my father back, Mr. Eastwood, as..." The young man's image faded. The camera caught a close-up of Eastwood's face. His expression remained composed, but there was a new brightness in his eyes, a slight tension around his mouth that suggested he was working to maintain his composure. The stories continued, each one more moving than the last. A woman who decided to pursue her passion for painting in her 60s after watching The Bridges of Madison County. A recovering alcoholic who found the strength to stay sober after seeing A Star is Born. A young filmmaker from Mexico who scraped together enough money to buy his first camera after watching a documentary about Eastwood's directing process. Each story illuminated a different aspect of how Eastwood's work had touched lives in ways he could never have anticipated when making these films. The cumulative effect was powerful, not just for Eastwood, but for everyone in the studio. In the control room, Dave checked his watch. "Time for the final story," he said quietly. Liz nodded. "This is the one that got to all of us during the pre-screening. If anything's going to break through his reserve, it'll be this." The last face to appear on the screen belonged to a woman in her early 40s, with dark hair and eyes that held both sadness and strength. The caption identified her as Michelle, 42, from Colorado. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice steady, despite the emotion evident in her expression. "8 years ago, my husband and I lost our teenage son in a car accident. The grief was beyond anything I can describe. For months, we could barely function. Our marriage was falling apart under the weight of it." Michelle took a deep breath. "6 months after the accident, my husband was flipping through channels and stopped on Hereafter. We watched it together, not really talking, just sitting in the same room for the first time in months." In the studio, Eastwood leaned forward, slightly, his attention completely focused on the screen. "There's that scene," Michelle continued, "where Matt Damon's character connects a woman with her dead son. The son says, 'Please tell my mom it wasn't her fault. She should not feel guilty.' My husband and I both started crying. Our son had been driving that night, but I'd been the one who let him take the car despite the bad weather." She wiped away a tear. "Something broke open between us while watching your film. We talked all night, really talked, about our guilt, our grief, our son. That was the beginning of our healing." Michelle looked directly into the camera, her eyes sincere. "Mr. Eastwood, I know you're known for tough guy roles in action films, but what you might not realize is how deeply your more reflective films touch people in their darkest moments. You gave us a way to start talking again when nothing else had worked. You helped save our marriage and maybe our lives." As Michelle's face faded from the screen, the studio remained completely silent. The camera focused on Eastwood's face, capturing a moment of rare vulnerability from the legendary filmmaker. His eyes were unmistakably wet now, his jaw working, slightly as he fought to maintain his composure. Rachel waited, giving him space to process what he'd just seen. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "I think what all these stories share, Clint, is that your films have offered people a way to process their own experiences. Grief, trauma, joy, love, through the stories you've chosen to tell." Eastwood cleared his throat, his voice rougher than usual when he responded. "I'm moved by what these folks shared," he said simply. "When you're making films, you're focused on telling a good story. You don't always think about how they might affect someone watching years later, in circumstances you couldn't imagine." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "That's the power of stories, I guess. They take on lives of their own once they leave your hands. Is there anything you'd like to say to the people who shared their stories?" Rachel asked. Eastwood looked directly into the camera. For a man known for his economy of words, his answer came straight from the heart. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion rarely heard from him in public. "Thank you for letting these films mean something in your lives. That's the greatest compliment any filmmaker could receive." In the audience, many were wiping away tears of their own, moved not just by the stories they'd heard, but by seeing this unexpected side of Clint Eastwood, the genuine emotion behind the stoic exterior. In the control room, Dave turned to Liz, his expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine emotion. "We did it," he said quietly. "We showed the man behind the legend." Liz nodded, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "And he's even more impressive than the legend, isn't he?" As Rachel prepared to move into the final segment of the interview, the atmosphere in the studio had transformed. What had begun as a standard promotional appearance had become something much more meaningful, a genuine connection between an artist and the people whose lives had been touched by his work in ways he'd never fully understood until now. For several moments, the studio remained in respectful silence. Rachel allowed this quiet to linger, understanding the weight of what had just transpired. Eastwood sat still, his weathered hands clasped together, his eyes reflecting the studio lights with unusual brightness. The legendary filmmaker who had built a career playing unflappable characters was visibly moved. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "I hope you don't mind us surprising you with those stories, Clint." Eastwood cleared his throat. "No," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "No, that was something special." In the control room, Dave spoke quietly, into his headset. "Let's go to the final segment. Camera 2, stay on Eastwood, don't miss anything." Rachel nodded, glancing down briefly at her notes. "There's one more thing we wanted to share with you today, if that's all right. Something that brings together everything we've been talking about, your remarkable career, your impact on the industry, and most importantly, the way your storytelling has touched ordinary lives." Eastwood nodded, an almost imperceptible gesture that betrayed his emotional state. For a man known for his control and composure, even this slight acknowledgement spoke volumes. "What we found," Rachel continued, "is that there's a thread connecting all these stories we've heard today. Not just the professional tributes from your colleagues, but especially those personal stories from viewers whose lives were changed by your films." She turned toward the screen once more. "With your permission, we'd like to share one final piece with you and our audience." "Go ahead," Eastwood said quietly. The studio lights dimmed for the last time, and the screen came to life with something different. Not individual testimonials this time, but a thoughtfully crafted montage that moved chronologically through Eastwood's career, from his earliest roles to his most recent work as a director. But unlike typical career retrospectives that focused solely on famous scenes or critical acclaim, this one juxtaposed moments from his films with the real-world impact they had created. A clip from Unforgiven dissolved into images of ethics classes at film schools where the movie was used to discuss moral complexity. A scene from $1 Million Baby transitioned to footage of a disability rights conference where panelists discussed the film's impact on conversations about dignity and choice. As the montage progressed, it revealed something profound about Eastwood's legacy, not just as a filmmaker, but as someone whose work had become part of the cultural conversation around essential human questions: justice, redemption, mortality, and purpose. The final segment of the montage shifted to focus on Eastwood's directorial style, featuring behind-the-scenes footage rarely seen by the public. Here was Eastwood gently guiding an actor through a difficult emotional scene, his direction brief but incisive. There he was, listening intently to a crew member's suggestion, nodding with respect regardless of the person's position on set. Over. These images, voiceovers from various collaborators, spoke about his unique approach. He creates a space where people do their best work because they want to, not because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. There's no yelling, no drama, just this quiet expectation of excellence that somehow brings it out in everyone around him. He treats the person sweeping the floor with the same respect he gives to the star of the picture. That's not common in this business, and people don't forget it. The montage concluded with a simple statement that appeared on screen. Clint Eastwood. 7 decades of storytelling that changed how we see ourselves and each other. As the lights gradually came back up, the camera caught Eastwood in a moment of genuine vulnerability. A single tear had escaped and was making its way down his weathered cheek. He quickly reached up and brushed it away. but not before everyone. In the studio and millions watching at home had witnessed this rare display of emotion from Hollywood's most famously stoic figure. The audience, moved by what they had seen, began to applaud spontaneously. The applause quickly grew into a standing ovation that continued for nearly a minute, with Eastwood sitting somewhat uncomfortably under the weight of this public appreciation. When the audience finally settled, Rachel leaned forward. "I think it's safe to say you've meant a great deal to a lot of people, Clint." Eastwood nodded, visibly working to regain his composure. "I'm not sure what to say," he admitted, a rare confession of uncertainty from a man known for his decisiveness. "I've just tried to tell stories that matter, stories that feel true." "And why is that important to you?" Rachel asked gently. "Telling stories that feel true?" Eastwood considered this for a moment, thinking carefully as he always did before, speaking about something meaningful. "I think we make sense of our lives through stories," he said finally. "Always have, since people were drawing on cave walls. Good stories, honest stories, they help us understand something about ourselves, about each other, maybe even about what it means to be human." He paused, then added with characteristic understatement, "At least, that's the hope when you set out to make a film. Based on what we've seen today, I'd say you've succeeded," Rachel said warmly. Eastwood shook his head slightly. "The truth is, I'm still learning, still trying to get it right. Every film is a new challenge, a new chance to tell a story that might matter to someone." "At 94, you're still pushing yourself creatively," Rachel observed. "Many directors half your age have already retired or started repeating themselves. What would be the point of that?" Eastwood asked, a hint of his familiar wry humor returning. "If you're not trying to learn something new, to push yourself in some way, you might as well stay home." The audience laughed appreciatively, relieved to see glimpses of the Eastwood they knew emerging after such an emotional segment. "As we wrap up today," Rachel said, "I'm curious, what would you like people to remember most about your work? If you could distill your legacy into a single thought, what would it be?" Eastwood took a moment, his expression thoughtful. This was not a man who trafficked in platitudes or rehearsed responses. When he spoke, the words came from somewhere genuine. "I'd like them to remember that I respected the audience," he said. "Never talked down to them. Never tried to tell them what to think. Just tried to present stories honestly and let people draw their own conclusions." He paused, then added, "And maybe that I tried to show that life is rarely black and white. The most interesting territory is all that gray area in between, where we all actually live." As the interview concluded and the credits began to roll, the camera held on Eastwood's face. There was a quiet dignity there, a man who had spent his life creating art that mattered, and was only now, perhaps, fully understanding the depth of its impact. In the green room, Tom watched the monitor with a satisfied smile. He'd known Eastwood for 15 years and had rarely seen him so genuinely moved. When the director finally walked off set and joined him, Tom simply handed him a bottle of water without comment. Eastwood took it with a nod of thanks. "That was unexpected," he said after a moment. "Good unexpected?" Tom asked. Eastwood considered this, then nodded. "Yeah, good unexpected." As they gathered their things to leave, a young production assistant approached nervously. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you. My grandfather and I watched The Mule together before he passed. It was the last film we shared, and it meant a lot to both of us." Eastwood looked at her with newfound awareness of what such a statement might mean. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked. "Frank," she replied, surprised by the question. "Well," Eastwood said, "I'm glad Frank and you had that time together." He paused, then added, "Thank you for telling me." As they walked toward the exit, Tom noticed something different in Eastwood's demeanor, a subtle shift that most wouldn't recognize. "You okay?" he asked. Eastwood nodded, looking thoughtful. "You know, all these years I've been focused on making the next film, telling the next story. Never spent much time thinking about what happens after they leave my hands." He pushed open the door to the parking lot where the California sunshine greeted them. "Maybe that's been a mistake," he added quietly. How so? Tom asked. Eastwood looked out at the horizon, squinting slightly in the bright light. Stories matter, he said simply. Maybe more than I realized. As they walked to the waiting car, Eastwood straightened his shoulders, his mind already turning to the film he was currently editing. There would be time for reflection later. For now, there was still work to be done, still stories to tell. And perhaps after today, those stories would be informed by a deeper understanding of their potential impact, of the way a well-told story could echo in people's lives long after the credits rolled. The unexpected emotion he'd shown on camera would soon be trending across social media platforms, clips of the interview shared and commented on by millions. Critics and commentators would discuss this rare glimpse of vulnerability from Hollywood's most stoic icon. But Eastwood himself, true to form, was already looking ahead to the next challenge, the next story, carrying with him a new appreciation for the powerful connection between a storyteller and those whose lives were touched by the stories.